Shaquille O'Neal stops armed robbery, saves everyone inside. It was a quiet afternoon at the downtown branch of the Bank of America. The heavy oak doors creaked as customers filed in, their conversations blending with the faint hum of air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers behind the teller desks. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. A steady rhythm of everyday transactions filled the air. Pens scratching against forms, the mechanical clatter of cash-counting machines, and the polite murmur of tellers assisting their customers. Among the scattered patrons was a young mother, cradling a toddler on her hip while nervously eyeing her watch. An elderly man leaned on his cane as he carefully filled out a deposit slip, his hands trembling slightly with age. Near the far wall, a middle-aged businessman adjusted his tie while checking his phone, his briefcase resting at his feet. It was just another routine day until the atmosphere shifted. The tension arrived subtly at first. Two men entered the bank wearing heavy jackets despite the warm weather outside. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the room in quick, calculated motions. One of them, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, held the door open just a beat too long, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. The other, stockier and more broad-shouldered, tugged his jacket closer around his body, as if trying to conceal something beneath it. No one seemed to notice at first. The young mother continued bouncing her restless child, and the elderly man remained focused on his deposit slip. But Shaquille O'Neal, who stood near the entrance chatting casually with a security guard, noticed everything. At 7 feet 1 inch tall, Shaq was impossible to miss. Dressed in a crisp navy blue police uniform with a badge pinned proudly to his chest, he towered over everyone in the room, exuding an air of calm authority. Today, he was filling in as a community liaison officer, a role he often took on to stay connected to the people in his city. Shaq's sharp eyes followed the two men as they moved deeper into the bank. Something about them didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way they avoided eye contact with anyone or the slight bulge beneath the stocky man's jacket. Years of playing basketball had taught Shaq to read body language with precision, and what he was seeing now sent a ripple of unease through him. He shifted his stance, casually resting a massive hand on the baton clipped to his belt. Beside him, the security guard, a wiry man in his 50s, followed his gaze and muttered, "Something off about those two?" Shaq didn't answer right away. His years of experience, both on the court and in law enforcement, had taught him to trust his instincts. "Maybe," he said finally, his deep voice calm but firm. "Let's keep an eye on them." The two men stopped near the center of the bank, exchanging a quick glance. The stocky one reached inside his jacket, and in an instant, everything changed. "Everyone on the ground," he bellowed, pulling out a sawed-off shotgun and aiming it at the ceiling. The deafening crack of a warning shot shattered the calm, sending chunks of plaster raining down from above. The room erupted into chaos. Customers screamed and scrambled for cover, diving under desks and pressing themselves against walls. The young mother clutched her child tightly, her face pale with fear. The elderly man dropped his cane, his frail body trembling as he slowly lowered himself to the ground. "Do it now," the wiry man shouted, brandishing a handgun. "Hands where we can see them. Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt." Shaq's heart pounded, but his expression remained stoic. He quickly assessed the situation. Two armed suspects, at least a dozen terrified civilians, and only one security guard, who looked as though he hadn't faced a threat like this in years. Shaq knew he had to act, but he also knew the stakes. One wrong move could turn this tense standoff into a full-blown tragedy. The stocky man barked orders at the tellers, forcing them to empty their cash drawers into a black duffel bag. His partner prowled the room, waving his handgun wildly and barking threats at anyone who dared to move. "I said down, all the way down," he shouted at the businessman, who was cowering behind a nearby desk. Shaq crouched slightly, using his towering frame to shield the security guard. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're gonna get through this." The security guard nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for the radio clipped to his belt. But before he could call for backup, the wiry man noticed him. "You," he snarled, pointing his gun at the guard. "Drop it. Now!" The guard froze, his face pale as he slowly lowered the radio to the floor. Shaq clenched his fists. Every muscle in his body tensed like a coiled spring. He knew he had to wait for the right moment. Acting too soon could put everyone in even greater danger. The wiry man stepped closer, his gun still trained on the guard. "Good," he sneered. "Now kick it over." The guard obeyed, sliding the radio across the floor. It stopped just a few feet away from Shaq, who remained perfectly still, his sharp eyes locked on the gunman. The room was so silent now that the faint rustle of cash being stuffed into the duffel bag seemed deafening. "Keep filling it," the stocky man barked at the tellers, his voice thick with urgency. "And don't even think about hitting any alarms." As the wiry man turned back toward his partner, Shaq's mind raced. He needed a plan, something that would neutralize the threat without putting innocent lives at risk. His size and strength gave him an advantage, but the presence of firearms complicated everything. One wrong move, one twitch of a trigger finger, and someone could get hurt or worse. But Shaq was no stranger to pressure. He had spent decades performing under the brightest lights, making split-second decisions with the game on the line. This wasn't a basketball court, but the stakes felt just as high, if not higher. Lives were on the line, and he couldn't afford to miss. The wiry man moved back toward the center of the room, his pistol still trained on the scattered group of terrified customers. The younger ones crouched behind desks, clutching their phones as if contemplating a silent call for help. The elderly man lay flat on his stomach, muttering prayers under his breath, while the young mother clutched her toddler so tightly that the child's whimpers were barely audible. Every second seemed to stretch, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. "Move faster," the wiry man shouted at the tellers. His voice was sharp, tinged with desperation. The stocky man, who was still at the counter, waved the shotgun menacingly. He kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "We've got 5 minutes, tops," he hissed to his partner. "Grab what you can and let's go." Shaq crouched low, his massive frame shielded by a column near the entrance. The security guard sat frozen beside him, his face slick with sweat. "What do we do?" the guard whispered, his voice barely audible. Shaq didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, analyzing every detail of the situation. The robbers were nervous, their movements jittery and erratic. That could work to his advantage, but it also made them more dangerous. He needed to act soon, but not before he was sure he could do it without endangering the civilians. "I'll handle this," Shaq murmured finally, his deep voice steady. "Just stay here and keep everyone safe. Don't try anything." The guard opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Shaq's calm, determined expression silenced him. He gave a small nod, pressing himself further into the shadows. Meanwhile, the wiry man had turned his attention to the businessman cowering near the desks. "You," he barked, gesturing with his gun. "Get up. Empty your pockets. Wallet, phone, everything." The businessman scrambled to obey, his hands shaking as he pulled out his wallet and placed it on the floor. His phone followed, sliding a few inches across the marble tiles. "Please," he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I have a family." The wiry man smirked, stepping closer. "Yeah? Then maybe you should have stayed home today," he sneered, scooping up the wallet and pocketing the cash inside. He kicked the phone across the room, sending it skidding under a desk. "Next time, don't waste my time." As the robber turned away, Shaq's hands tightened into fists. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Acting on impulse wouldn't help anyone. He needed the perfect moment, when the robbers were distracted, their guard lowered just enough for him to strike. The stocky man's voice broke through his thoughts. "We've got enough," he barked, zipping up the duffel bag. "Let's move before." A shrill, piercing cry cut him off. All eyes turned toward the young mother, who was desperately trying to calm her toddler. The child, frightened by the loud noises and tense atmosphere, had started wailing uncontrollably. The mother shushed him frantically, her own eyes wide with panic as she tried to shield him from the robber's gaze. Shut that kid up, the wiry man snapped, his face twisting with irritation. He took a step toward her, raising his gun. I said, enough. Shaq's voice rang out, deep and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a knife. The room fell silent, every head turning toward the towering figure now stepping into view. His police badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his sheer size seemed to fill the room. For a moment, even the robbers appeared stunned, their weapons faltering slightly in their grips. The wiry man recovered first, his expression hardening. And who the hell are you supposed to be? He spat, aiming his gun at Shaq. Shaq didn't flinch. Someone you don't want to mess with, he said evenly, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Put the weapons down, and this doesn't have to get worse. The stocky man let out a bark of laughter. You serious? One guy against two of us? You think you're some kind of hero? Shaq took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. I think you're making a big mistake, he said, his eyes locked on the wiry man's gun. You don't want to hurt anyone. Not today. The wiry man hesitated for a split second, his grip on the gun faltering. But the stocky man wasn't as easily intimidated. Enough of this crap, he snarled, raising the shotgun. Take one more step, and I swear... Don't. Shaq interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. His gaze was steady, unyielding, as he fixed his eyes on the stocky man. Think about what you're doing. You pull that trigger and your life's over. There's no going back. For a moment, the room was completely still. The only sound was the faint whimpering of the toddler, now clinging to his mother's neck. The stocky man's finger twitched on the trigger, his jaw clenched. But something in Shaq's calm, unwavering demeanor seemed to give him pause. He glanced at his partner, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The wiry man stepped closer, his gun still trained on Shaq. You think you're smart? Huh? He growled. Think you can talk us down? I think you don't want this to end badly, Shaq replied, his tone steady. You've got the money. Walk away while you still can. The wiry man hesitated again, his gaze darting between Shaq and his partner. For a moment, it looked as though he might actually listen. But then the stocky man snarled, No way. We're not leaving empty-handed. If this guy wants to play hero, he can be the first one to go. He raised the shotgun, his movements jerky and frantic. Shaq's muscles tensed, his mind racing. The moment he'd been waiting for was here, but the stakes had just been raised. He knew he had to act, and fast. The stocky man tightened his grip on the shotgun, his movements growing more erratic. The faint tremor in his hands betrayed his nerves, but his eyes were wild, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He took a step closer to Shaq, the barrel of the weapon pointing squarely at his chest. You think you're big enough to scare us? He spat, his voice rising. You're nothing but a badge and a big mouth. I'll show you who's in charge here. Shaq's expression didn't waver. He stood firm, his towering presence radiating calm authority. His broad shoulders and steady gaze seemed to absorb the tension in the room, grounding it. But inside, his mind was racing. He calculated the angles, the distance, the robbers' positions. The wiry man was flanking him, guns still trained on him, while the stocky one stood just a few feet away. Two armed men, one unpredictable, the other teetering on the edge of panic. One wrong move could send this fragile situation spiraling into chaos. Behind Shaq, the security guard was frozen in place, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The mother clutched her crying child, her knuckles white as she tried to shield him from the unfolding danger. The elderly man had managed to crawl behind a desk, peeking out with wide, terrified eyes. Everyone in the room was trapped in the same suffocating suspense, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the stalemate. You're not gonna shoot me, Shaq said calmly, his deep voice cutting through the robber's tirade. His tone wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was steady, measured, as if he were stating a simple fact. Because if you were going to, you'd have done it already. The stocky man's jaw clenched, and his finger twitched on the trigger. Don't test me, he roared. You don't know what I'm capable of. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze unyielding. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice softening just enough to carry an undertone of understanding. "I know you think this is your only way out, but it's not. Put the gun down and we can talk." The wiry man let out a sharp laugh, breaking the tension for a brief moment. "Talk? Are you serious?" He gestured wildly with his pistol, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's there to talk about, huh? You're a cop. He's a crook. End of story." But Shaq didn't take his eyes off the stocky man. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said firmly. "I'm here to make sure no one else gets hurt. Especially you." The stocky man faltered, the barrel of the shotgun dipping slightly. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The wiry man noticed the hesitation and snarled, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to mess with your head." "I'm trying to keep you alive," Shaq countered, his gaze briefly flicking to the wiry man before locking back on the stocky one. "Think about it. You pull that trigger and what happens next? Police swarm this place. You won't make it out of here. But if you put the gun down now, we can end this without anyone else getting hurt." The wiry man swore under his breath, clearly growing agitated. "This is a waste of time," he snapped. "Let's grab the rest of the cash and get out of here before—" The sharp blare of a distant siren cut him off. It was faint, barely audible through the thick glass doors, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through both robbers. The wiry man whipped his head toward the entrance, his grip on the pistol tightening. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice cracking with tension. "We don't have time for this." The stocky man's eyes darted between Shaq and his partner, his indecision written across his face. The duffel bag stuffed with cash sat at his feet, a stark reminder of the life he thought he could escape to. But now, with the looming threat of law enforcement closing in, that dream was slipping through his fingers. Shaq took a slow step forward, his hands still raised in a non-threatening gesture. "It's not too late," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've got a choice to make. Do the right thing and you'll walk out of here alive. But if you keep pushing, this only ends one way." The stocky man hesitated, his grip on the shotgun loosening ever so slightly. Shaq's heart pounded, every fiber of his being focused on the fragile moment unfolding before him. He could see the internal struggle playing out in the robber's eyes. The fear, the doubt, the desperate hope that there was still a way out. But the wiry man wasn't about to let his partner waver. "Are you kidding me?" he barked, stepping closer and shoving the stocky man's shoulder. "Don't let him get in your head. He's just stalling. We need to move now." The shove jolted the stocky man back to reality. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the shotgun firmed. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He straightened his posture and aimed the weapon squarely at Shaq. "Nice try," he said coldly, his voice devoid of the earlier uncertainty. "But this ain't ending the way you think it will." Shaq's eyes narrowed, his muscles tensing. The room seemed to shrink around him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his broad shoulders. He knew the window of opportunity was closing fast. The robbers were cornered, desperate, and dangerous, and the slightest misstep could turn the standoff into a bloodbath. In the corner of his vision, Shaq saw a flicker of movement. The young mother was shifting ever so slightly, trying to position herself between her child and the gunman. The elderly man was inching further behind the desk, his frail body trembling with every movement. The businessman was clutching his briefcase like a lifeline, his eyes darting between Shaq and the robbers. Shaq took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to act, but the timing had to be perfect. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and the situation would spiral out of control. He clenched his fists, his massive frame coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action the moment the opportunity presented itself. The stocky man's knuckles were bone white as he gripped the shotgun, his finger twitching dangerously near the trigger. The wiry man circled Shaq like a predator, his pistol now leveled directly at his face. The room was drowning in silence, broken only by the muffled sound of the sirens growing louder in the distance. Every civilian in the bank was paralyzed with fear, their eyes darting between Shaq and the robbers, as if the giant officer was their last lifeline. You think this is a game? The wiry man snarled, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. You don't get to play hero here. You're outnumbered, and you've got nothing but that shiny badge to hide behind. Shaq didn't flinch. His towering frame remained steady. His eyes locked on the wiry man with an intensity that seemed to unnerve him. You're scared, Shaq said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You're trying to act tough, but I see it. You're not in control anymore. The wiry man's lips curled into a snarl. Shut up, he barked, stepping closer. The barrel of his pistol was now mere feet from Shaq's chest. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know enough, Shaq replied, his tone calm but firm. You didn't come in here with a plan. You're making this up as you go, and now you're cornered. The cops are on their way, and you've got no way out. The wiry man's eyes flicked to the entrance, the sound of sirens gnawing at his composure. He whipped back around, jabbing the gun toward Shaq. I said shut up, he shouted, his voice cracking. One more word and... You'll shoot me? Shaq interrupted, his deep voice resonating with unshakable confidence. He took a small step forward, his massive frame towering over the wiry man. Go ahead, pull the trigger. See how far you get. The wiry man froze, his hand trembling slightly. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. Shaq's calm, unwavering demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them, and it was throwing him off balance. The stocky man noticed the hesitation and growled, stepping up beside his partner. Don't let him mess with your head, the stocky man muttered, his voice low and urgent. He's trying to stall us. Let's finish this and get out of here. Shaq's eyes flicked between the two men, gauging their movements, their body language. He could see the cracks forming in their resolve, but they were still dangerous, cornered animals with nothing left to lose. He needed to keep them talking, keep them distracted long enough to find an opening. You think you're in charge here, Shaq said, addressing both men now. But you're not. You're panicking. Every second you waste here, the cops get closer. You can hear them, can't you? Those sirens are for you. The stocky man's jaw tightened, his grip on the shotgun shifting slightly. We'll be gone before they get here, he snapped. You think we're stupid? We've got this under control. Shaq tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're running out of time and options. The stocky man's face darkened, his frustration boiling over. Enough of this crap, he shouted, stepping forward and pressing the shotgun against Shaq's chest. You think you're so smart, huh? You think you've got us figured out? Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He stared down at the stocky man, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the robber's frenzied energy. I think you don't want to do this, he said quietly. I think you're looking for a way out. The stocky man's breath hitched, just for a moment. The wiry man noticed the hesitation and swore under his breath. What's wrong with you? He hissed, stepping closer. This guy's playing us. Stop listening to him and do something. The tension in the room was suffocating. The civilians huddled on the floor were frozen, their eyes wide with terror as they watched the standoff unfold. The young mother clutched her child so tightly that the boy had stopped crying, his face buried in her shoulder. The elderly man was gripping the edge of the desk, his frail body trembling with every shallow breath. Even the businessman, who had been quietly inching toward the door, had stopped in his tracks, his eyes fixed on Shaq. Look around you, Shaq said, his voice low but firm. These people didn't do anything to you. They're just here to deposit their paychecks to take care of their families. You're the ones who turned this into a nightmare. You're the ones who can end it. The wiry man laughed bitterly, his pistol still trained on Shaq. You really think we care about them? We're not here to play nice. We're here to get what's ours. And then what? Shaq shot back. You walk out of here with a bag of cash and what? Think the cops won't catch you? Think they'll let you go after you threaten to kill innocent people? The wiry man hesitated, his bravado faltering for a split second. The stocky man glanced at his partner, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The sirens were louder now, closer. The faint red and blue lights of approaching squad cars flashed against the bank's glass doors, casting an eerie glow across the room. "We don't have time for this," the wiry man snapped, his voice rising. "Grab the bag and let's go." But the stocky man didn't move. His hands were still on the shotgun, but his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He looked at Shaq, then at the terrified civilians, and for a moment, something that looked almost like regret flashed across his face. Shaq saw it. He saw the doubt, the hesitation, and he knew he was getting through to them. But the wiry man wasn't about to let his partner waver. "Hey!" he barked, stepping closer and shoving the stocky man. "What are you waiting for? Let's go." The stocky man stumbled slightly, his grip on the shotgun faltering. Shaq's muscles tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act. But he held back, waiting for the perfect moment. The situation was still too volatile, the risk too high. The wiry man's eyes darted back to Shaq, his pistol trembling slightly in his hands. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you've got us beat?" Shaq's expression didn't change. "I think you've already lost," he said quietly. The wiry man's face twisted in rage, his finger tightening on the trigger. The stocky man took a step back, his own shotgun dipping slightly. The room was a pressure cooker, seconds away from exploding. The wiry man's finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger, the shaking of his hand now impossible to ignore. His erratic breathing filled the silent void of the room as every set of eyes remained glued to the standoff. The stocky man shifted uneasily, his shotgun drooping lower as doubt crept into his posture. Shaq noticed the crack forming in their unity and knew this was his opening. "You're done?" Shaq said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. His towering presence remained unyielding, his eyes locked on the wiry man. "You can feel it, can't you? This is over. You're not walking out of here with that bag, or your freedom." The wiry man's lips twitched in a snarl. "You think I'm scared of you?" he hissed, though the quaver in his voice betrayed him. "I'll do it. I swear to God. I'll pull this trigger." Shaq took a deliberate step forward, his sheer size eclipsing the space between them. The barrel of the shotgun pressed harder against his chest as the wiry man took a reflexive step back. "If you were going to shoot," Shaq said slowly, his voice a low rumble, "you'd have done it already. But you won't, because deep down you know there's no way out." The wiry man whipped his head toward his partner, his frustration boiling over. "Are you just going to stand there?" he snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "Do something." The stocky man didn't respond immediately. His grip on the shotgun slackened slightly as his gaze flicked toward the terrified civilians huddled on the floor. The young mother had tears streaming down her face as she shielded her toddler, her body trembling with fear. The elderly man clung to the edge of the desk, his frail hands shaking uncontrollably. It was a scene of utter helplessness, and for the first time, the stocky man seemed to take it in. "I don't know, man," the stocky man muttered, his voice low and uncertain. This isn't what I signed up for." "What?" the wiry man snapped, his eyes widening. "Don't tell me you're chickening out now. We're too far in. There's no turning back." Shaq seized the moment, his deep voice cutting through their argument. "Listen to him," he said, addressing the stocky man directly. "He's right, you didn't sign up for this. But you don't have to go down with him. Put the gun down, and I'll make sure you get out of this alive." The stocky man's eyes darted between Shaq and his partner, uncertainty written all over his face. The wiry man noticed the hesitation and swore under his breath. "Don't listen to him," he barked, his voice rising. "He's just trying to mess with your head. We stick to the plan, we get out of here." "What plan?" Shaq interjected, his voice steady but commanding. "You're cornered. The cops are outside. The civilians are terrified. And your partner's starting to realize this isn't worth his life. There's no plan here, just desperation." The wiry man's face twisted in rage. "Shut up," he shouted, his gun hand shaking violently. "I'm done listening to you." But Shaq wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his massive frame practically towering over the wiry man now. "You're scared," Shaq said, his voice low and deliberate. "And you should be. Because the longer you stay here, the worse this gets for you. But it doesn't have to end like this." The wiry man's breathing quickened, his chest heaving as he struggled to maintain control. The stocky man took a half step back, his shotgun lowering further as the weight of the situation bore down on him. Shaq could see it, the cracks widening, the fragile alliance between the two robbers starting to splinter. The sirens outside were deafening now, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass doors. The faint sound of police officers shouting commands into megaphones filtered into the bank, adding another layer of tension to the already volatile scene. "Time's up," Shaq said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is your last chance. Put the weapons down, and I promise no one else gets hurt." Their argument escalated, the tension between them threatening to boil over. Shaq watched intently, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act the moment the situation tipped in his favor. He could see the fear in the wiry man's eyes, the desperation in the stocky man's stance. They were unraveling, their fragile control over the situation slipping through their fingers. The wiry man turned back to Shaq, his face a mask of fury. "This is on you," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you're so smart, so tough, but you don't know who you're messing with." Shaq took another step forward, his gaze unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "And I know you're better than this. Both of you." The wiry man let out a bitter laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. "Better? There's no better. This is who we are." "No," Shaq said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "This is who you've let yourself become. But it doesn't have to be." The wiry man faltered, his gun hand dropping slightly as his resolve wavered. The stocky man took another step back, his shotgun now pointed at the floor. The room was a pressure cooker, seconds away from exploding, and Shaq knew the moment of reckoning was near. The wiry man's face was a cocktail of rage and fear, his resolve visibly splintering under the weight of the escalating chaos. His pistol, once steady in his grip, now trembled with every shallow breath he took. The stocky man stood a few feet behind him, his shotgun drooping to his side, his posture slumping like a man who had already given up. Shaq knew this was the critical moment, the fragile tipping point where everything would either come crashing down or be defused. Outside, the sirens had reached their crescendo, the flashing red and blue lights painting the bank's interior in eerie, flickering hues. The distant, distorted sound of a police megaphone crackled through the air. "This is the police. Lay down your weapons and come out with your hands up." The wiry man flinched at the sound, his eyes darting toward the door for a split second. It was all the opening Shaq needed. With the speed and precision of a trained professional, Shaq lunged forward, his massive hand shooting out to grab the barrel of the wiry man's pistol. The man let out a startled yell, his grip tightening instinctively on the gun. But Shaq's strength was overwhelming. In one fluid motion, he wrenched the weapon from the wiry man's hand and tossed it across the room, where it clattered to the floor, well out of reach. "Get back!" the stocky man shouted, raising his shotgun in panic. But before he could aim, Shaq pivoted, using his towering frame to shield the nearest civilians while simultaneously closing the distance between him and the stocky man. His movements were swift and deliberate, his years of athletic training and law enforcement experience converging in this critical moment. "Don't do it," Shaq barked, his voice a thunderous command that seemed to shake the very walls. The stocky man froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and regret. I don't want to hurt anyone," the stocky man stammered, his voice cracking. His hands trembled as he held the shotgun, the weight of the weapon seeming to overwhelm him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It doesn't have to go any further," Shaq said firmly, his deep voice resonating with authority. "Put the gun down. Right now." The stocky man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Shaq and the wiry man, who was now crumpled on the floor, clutching his wrist in pain. The room was deathly silent, the civilians too terrified to make a sound. Even the sirens outside seemed muted, the entire world narrowing to this single, charged moment. "Drop it," Shaq repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is your chance. Do the right thing." The stocky man's grip faltered, his shoulders slumping further. His eyes darted toward the duffel bag filled with cash, then back to Shaq. The weight of his choices, his mistakes, seemed to crush him all at once. With a shaky exhale, he slowly lowered the shotgun to the floor. "I'm done," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm done." Shaq didn't relax, not yet. His sharp eyes remained locked on the stocky man as he kicked the shotgun out of reach. The wiry man let out a low groan, still clutching his wrist, but he made no move to get up. The standoff was over, but Shaq knew the situation wasn't truly resolved until everyone was safe. "Stay down," Shaq ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. He turned toward the security guard, who was still crouched behind a column, his face pale with fear. "Call it in," Shaq said. "Let them know it's under control." The guard nodded shakily, fumbling with his radio as he relayed the update to the officers outside. The civilians began to stir, their fear slowly giving way to relief as they realized the immediate danger had passed. The young mother hugged her toddler tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered soothing words into his ear. The elderly man let out a shaky breath, his frail hands clutching the desk for support as he tried to steady himself. Shaq turned his attention back to the robbers. The stocky man was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, while the wiry man glared up at Shaq with a mixture of hatred and defeat. "You ruined everything," the wiry man spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Shaq crouched down, his massive frame still imposing even at eye level. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just someone who doesn't want to see anyone else get hurt." The wiry man looked away, his jaw tightening as he bit back a retort. The stocky man let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping further. "He's right," the stocky man muttered. "We were never gonna get away with this." Before Shaq could respond, the doors to the bank burst open, a team of heavily armed officers storming in with their weapons drawn. Hands in the air, one of them shouted, their voices echoing through the room. "Now!" The stocky man raised his hands immediately, his movements slow and deliberate. The wiry man hesitated for a moment, his face twisted in frustration, but he eventually complied, his hands shaking as he raised them above his head. The officers moved in quickly, securing the robbers and ensuring the civilians were safe. Shaq stood back, his massive frame towering over the chaos as he watched the scene unfold. The security guard approached him, his face still pale but his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," the guard said, his voice trembling. "You saved all of us." Shaq gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on the robbers as they were led out of the bank in handcuffs. "Just doing my job," he said quietly. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. He looked around the room, taking in the shaken faces of the civilians, the damage to the bank, and the sheer magnitude of what could have gone wrong. It was a sobering reminder of the risks he faced every day, risks he was willing to take to protect the people in his community. Shaq stood near the center of the room, his massive frame still and steady amidst the commotion. He watched silently as the officers ushered the robbers into the waiting squad cars, their defiance now replaced by quiet resignation. The wiry man shot a venomous glare in Shaq's direction as he was shoved into the back seat, but Shaq didn't react. His focus was elsewhere, on the civilians who were beginning to rise from their hiding spots, their faces pale and drawn. "Is everyone okay?" Shaq asked, his deep voice cutting through the noise. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes lingering on each person to ensure they were unharmed. The young mother nodded tearfully, clutching her toddler close to her chest. The elderly man gave a shaky thumbs up, his frail hands still gripping the desk for support. The businessman, who had been frozen in terror for most of the ordeal, muttered a quiet "yeah" as he dusted off his suit. "You're safe now," Shaq said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's over." The words seemed to release a collective breath from the room. The young mother sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed quietly into her son's hair. The elderly man managed a weak smile, his relief palpable. The businessman let out a long exhale, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he leaned heavily against a wall. The security guard approached Shaq, his face still pale but filled with gratitude. I don't even know what to say," he stammered, his voice trembling. You saved us. If you hadn't been here." Shaq raised a massive hand, cutting him off gently. "You did your job," he said. "You stayed calm and kept people safe. That's what matters." The guard shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But you went up against them like it was nothing. I've never seen anything like that." Shaq gave a small shrug, his expression unreadable. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said simply. As the officers continued their work, one of them approached Shaq, a look of both respect and curiosity on his face. "That was incredible," the officer said, extending a hand. "I've seen a lot in this job, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone handle a situation like that. You kept everyone safe without a single shot being fired." Shaq shook the officer's hand, his grip firm but controlled. "Just trying to keep the peace," he replied. "That's the goal." The officer nodded, his admiration evident. "Well, you did more than that. You saved lives today." Shaq didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the young mother, who was now soothing her child with soft whispers. To the elderly man, who was slowly making his way to a chair with the help of another officer. To the businessman, who had finally found his phone and was frantically texting, likely to let someone know he was okay. The weight of their gratitude was heavy, but Shaq bore it without complaint. This was why he did what he did, why he had chosen to serve and protect. As the scene began to wind down, a senior officer approached Shaq, his expression both stern and respectful. "We'll take it from here," he said, his tone professional. "But I have to say, that was one hell of a thing you did. Most officers would have waited for backup, but you went in there and handled it." Shaq nodded, his face serious. "I assessed the situation," he said. "I saw an opening and took it. Backup might not have gotten here in time." The senior officer sighed, shaking his head. "Still, it was a risk. A big one. You could have been hurt or worse." "I know," Shaq said quietly, "but it's not about me. It's about them." He gestured toward the civilians, who were now being comforted and interviewed by the officers. "They're the priority. Always." The senior officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you've earned a lot of respect today. Not just from us, but from everyone in this room." Shaq didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to the civilians, his expression softening. He approached the young mother, crouching slightly so he could meet her tear-filled eyes. "You're okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my baby." Shaq gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just take care of him," he said. "That's all the thanks I need." The elderly man was next, his frail hand reaching out to grip Shaq's massive one. "Son," the man said, his voice shaky but sincere, "I've seen a lot in my years, but I've never seen bravery like that. You're a good man." Shaq squeezed the man's hand gently, his voice soft as he replied, "Just doing what I could, sir." The businessman approached hesitantly, his phone still in hand. I don't usually say stuff like this, but..." "Thank you," he said awkwardly. "That was incredible." Shaq nodded, his smile faint but genuine. "Glad you're okay," he said simply. As the civilians were escorted out of the bank, Shaq remained behind, watching as the officers continued their work. The adrenaline was starting to fade now, replaced by a deep, quiet exhaustion. But he stood tall, his presence still commanding, still steady. The senior officer approached him again, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're a hell of an asset to this city," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Shaq didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, his gaze distant as he reflected on the events of the day. The robbers were in custody, the civilians were safe, and the bank was secure. It was a good outcome, better than most in situations like this. But Shaq knew the real victory wasn't just in what he had done, but in the lives that would continue because of it. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars began to fade into the evening light as the chaos subsided. The bank's front doors were now propped open, allowing the warm breeze of the late afternoon to flow in, carrying with it a strange calmness. The civilians had been escorted out, many of them glancing back toward the towering figure of Shaq with expressions of gratitude and disbelief. The tension that had gripped the bank just an hour earlier now felt like a distant memory. Shaq leaned against the marble counter near the teller booths, his massive arms crossed over his chest. His breathing had returned to normal, but his mind replayed every moment of the standoff. The wiry man's pistol trembling in his hand, the stocky man's hesitation, the weight of every decision he had made. It all lingered like an echo in his chest. The senior officer approached him again, his notepad tucked into his pocket. "We've got statements from everyone," he said. "The civilians are shaken, but they're all safe, thanks to you." Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's what matters," he said quietly. His deep voice carried a weight that matched the day's events. The officer studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the door. "Why don't you step outside? Take a breather. You've done more than enough here." For a moment, Shaq considered arguing, insisting he could help with the cleanup or the paperwork. But the exhaustion in his limbs and the fading adrenaline told him the officer was right. He nodded again, pushing off the counter and walking toward the doors. His sheer size made every step seem deliberate, but there was a quiet grace to his movements, a calm strength that had kept the entire room anchored when everything else was falling apart. As Shaq stepped out into the open air, the crowd that had gathered across the street began to murmur. Phones were raised, capturing photos and videos of the man who had single-handedly stopped a robbery without a single shot fired. Shaq ignored the attention, his focus on the horizon as he inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. "Excuse me, Officer O'Neill?" a voice called out, tentative but firm. Shaq turned to see the young mother from inside the bank, her toddler now fast asleep in her arms. She approached him cautiously, her eyes still red from crying but filled with determination. I couldn't leave without saying thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You didn't just save us, you saved my son's life. I'll never forget what you did today." Shaq looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "Just take care of him. That's all the thanks I need." The woman nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "You're a hero," she said simply, her voice filled with emotion. "Whether you want to admit it or not." Shaq smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth barely turning up. "I'm just here to help," he said, his tone humble. "That's all I've ever wanted to do." As the mother walked away, Shaq glanced back at the bank. The senior officer was standing near the entrance, talking to another officer and gesturing toward the interior. The robbers were long gone, the civilians were safe, and the chaos had been replaced by order. It was a good day, a rare good day. Shaq's gaze drifted toward the crowd across the street. He spotted the elderly man, who gave him a small, shaky wave. The businessman, now holding his phone to his ear, nodded at him in acknowledgement. Even in their shaken states, they all seemed to carry a newfound sense of safety, as if Shaq's presence had reminded them that not all hope was lost. The world wasn't perfect, far from it, but for this moment on this street corner in a bustling city, it felt just a little bit better, and that was enough for Shaq. He turned away from the crowd, his massive figure casting a long shadow in the fading sunlight. There was still work to be done, still people to protect, still lives to change. And as long as he could stand, as long as he could fight, Shaq knew he'd be there, ready to answer the call.